What forms of spirituality are most appealing to Western minds? Do we need to stick to one spiritual path, or can we pick and choose? Is yoga anything more than just exercise? And do we need to bring a concept of karma into our daily lives? Welcome to another episode of the Bordering on Belief podcast. Philip Goldberg is an author and spiritual counsellor. He's spent over 60 years as a seeker on the spiritual path. Delving into traditions such as Buddhism, Taoism and Hinduism, he became a proponent of transcendental meditation after the Beatles got involved in the 1960s. Now he describes himself as a freelance yogi and has written popular books such as American Vedanta, How Indian Spirituality Changed the West, and most recently Karmic Relief, Harnessing the Laws of Cause and Effect for a Joyful, Meaningful Life. Philip, thank you very much for joining us today.
Great to be with you, Mohammed.
Could we start with you outlining your own spiritual journey and culminating in what your current view of God or the divine is?
That's a tall order. I could take up the whole conversation just with that. Well, I was raised in New York City post-World War II by parents of Jewish descent, but militant atheists. So I had no religious background, no religious training at all. And in college, maintained that kind of religion is the opium of the people mentality as a political kid. And but then I was searching for answers to important questions of life and trying to get my own life in order in the late 60s when things were a little crazy and turbulent here. And in that mix of influences, I started to be drawn to reading about Eastern philosophy. It started with reading about Zen and Buddhism, and then to the Vedantic and yogic streams of what we call Hinduism. And I just was fascinated by it all, and it all seemed to offer hope for answers to the bigger questions that were more satisfying than the ones that came from a conventional religion or from secular sources like psychology, which I had majored in. And for whatever reason, I was drawn to those teachings and just wanted to learn more and more and more, and I did. And that exploration led to the inevitable conclusion that, reading and learning on that level was not the most important thing. And there were practices, methodologies in these systems that came from the East that anybody could practice in a sort of experimental way. That, like the title of your podcast, was more than just belief. And so in hungering for the direct experiences of something transcendent, I started to experiment with forms of meditation and ended up learning transcendental meditation not long after the Beatles did. That was an important moment in history. It was transformative. And so I ended up becoming a teacher of that methodology and being involved with that world for several years. And that was the sort of beginning and the stamp of what my subsequent explorations would be. And if I had to categorize it, I would say I became kind of a freelance mystic, or I sometimes say a pragmatic mystic, just learning from whatever tradition um, seems to have something to offer, and they all do. And so in the end, I'm, probably people would categorize me as a yogi or a Vedantist, or some would say a Hindu. But I'm really anything that forges a deeper connection to the divine, um, and has practical value in life. I'm all for it. And so that in my writings and my public teachings and courses, they all reflect that kind of integration of the deep essence of all the world's traditions that is often summarized as perennial philosophy. And you asked how I see God or the divine. I try not to use the word God because most people think I mean something I don't if I use the term. So I always say, well, it depends on what you mean by God. And so I prefer terms like the divine or the infinite or the eternal, that have no sectarian overtones and no confusion. And I see, and my understanding of that is very much in line with Vedanta and most of the mystical traditions of seeing God, if you will, as transcendent and beyond human comprehension and beyond form and beyond substance. And at the same time, in and as everything, that everything is divine and everything is sacred. They say it's both transcendent and immanent, is how I understand it. Um, and that's what makes it omnipresent.
We'll unpick. I mean, I think that's a great summary for the rest of the discussion. So we'll unpick bits of that. Let's just go back in history to the 60s. Not having been there and just reading about it, it seems like it was a magical, but also, as you say, a very turbulent time. What was going on in the 60s? And you referred to it as a pivotal moment when the Beatles kind of went into meditation.
Yeah.
What was going on? Do you think there was something kind of cosmic going on in the 60s?
There's something cosmic going on all the time, but it was an upheaval with historic consequences. I forget how old I am, and that most people listening probably were not alive, but their parents or grandparents were. And it was a pivotal time. And I can speak to it from what was going on in America, but I know from experience that it was also going on in the UK and other parts of Europe and in different ways all over the world. There was, for one thing, the Vietnam War was raging, and there were cultural currents of change and transformation, questioning everything, values, politics, culture, art. And for those of us and of course I should add, um, psychedelic drugs were a big part of that. And any of us who were involved with what was then called the counterculture, um, to wonder, even if it was only to be on the fringes of it, were affected by these currents. And it led, of course, culturally to gay rights and feminism and environmental consciousness and all kinds of changes that had a real impact, sexual changes and values and so forth. Spiritually, for those who were involved in the counterculture and were seekers and not just political activists or anything, well, there was a lot of overlap. That's where the teachings of the mystical traditions, whether it was Sufism or mystical Christianity or Kabbalah, but mostly the teachings from the East. That's when the gurus from India and the roshis and lamas from the Buddhist countries were having a big influence on especially young people. In that mix, in 67 and 68, the Beatles, who were the most famous young people in the universe at that time, were seekers, and especially George, and that led them to take up transcendental meditation, and that was enormous because so many young people followed the Beatles' lead, whether it was musically or in fashion or in culture or whatever. So when they did this and said there's value in it, thousands and thousands of young people want to do it as well. And I eventually was one of them. I resisted at first because I didn't want to do it just because the Beatles did.
You're a late
But
adopter,
it
as they
had
call
value. And what happened as a result of that was these teachings that were on the fringe uh, gradually entered the mainstream because they had practical value. So our lives changed. I became, my life got much more together and much more coherent, and I gave up a lot of bad habits. And that was happening to a lot of people who took up meditation or yoga or Zen or whatever. And their parents and professors and scientists said, "What's going on here? Is this just a massive placebo or something, or is something really going on?" And they did studies, and the studies verified that these teachings have value. And that's when they began to enter the mainstream and become, sort of medicalized and adopted by therapists and so forth. And that trend has continued for more than 40 years now. So,
I was going to ask you that. Yeah, there was obviously an awakening or a blossoming, you might call it, in the 60s. Do you feel that that has continued at a similar kind of rate of growth? Or do you feel that in recent decades there's been almost a closing down of spiritual awareness?
it's interesting because a lot of people of my generation, we talk about that because we we had expectations that there would be a massive spiritual revolution that would end up making the world, some ideal place, and there'll be no more wars and no more political and social madness. That didn't quite work out as this is obvious in the daily headlines. But on a spiritual level, if you look at the trends, and I'm again speaking mostly about America because that's where I live, but I think it applies to at least parts of Western Europe as well. Um, there's been a huge shift in people's attitudes and understanding of what religion is, how they approach their spirituality, how they view their own traditions, how they view other traditions. And those, despite the news and politics and everything, those hold and those grow. So more and more people will say, as time goes by, that they're spiritual but not necessarily religious in the conventional way, or that they're open to learning from other spiritual traditions than their own, and to respect them and to honor them. And mainly that what matters to them is not what matters about religion and spirituality is not dogma and doctrine and belief system, but personal inner experience. And that trend has been growing and growing since the 60s.
Why do you think Vedanta, in particular, gained traction in the West and in America compared to, say, other forms of Hindu religion or other religious traditions?
Yeah, well, the Vedanta stream of Hinduism, and I would add to what you said that there's a parallel trend in Buddhism, the influence of Buddhism, the acceptability of Buddhism, the acceptability of the yoga and Vedanta streams of Hinduism uh, have been what appeal to Westerners, not so much the everyday normative Hinduism and Buddhism that you see in Asia, or in Buddhist neighborhoods or Hindu neighborhoods where people go to temples and worship and have deities and images and so forth. And that was an almost deliberate effort by the representatives of these teachings. They knew that Americans and Western Europeans, especially secular ones, are rational people. They value science. They value pragmatism. They value what works. And those streams, and we could just focus on Vedanta, but it's similar in streams of Buddhism and yoga, they tend to be compatible with rational thinking, with reason and logic. They don't, the ideas and precepts don't run counter to known science or known history, as many belief systems do. And so they focused on presenting a rational system of thought that has certain views as apprehended by the ancient seers, the key to which you will find in the, let me backtrack a second. Vedanta means the end or culmination of the Vedas. And it's the teachings from the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita that are captured in those texts that form the basic principles of Vedanta. And, if I have to be simplistic about it, is that, the whole universe is divine, and that beyond attributes, beyond form and substance, but expresses itself in the world as consciousness and existence and bliss, or ananda, or ultimate contentment when it's experienced, and that we are that. And that's the sort of substance of Vedanta. It's usually captured in the phrase tattvam asi in Sanskrit, which means thou art that. And that's the ultimate, insight that what we see as the divine is also what we are, and that can be experienced through methods like meditation. And that's why it caught on. And people were not asked to adopt a belief system. They were asked to just treat these teachings as a possibly being true and possibly having value for you, and to test them out in your own experience. And those of us who did that said, "Oh, there's value here. This could be real. This could be true. So I'm going to continue studying it." And that if what came to the West was only sort of temple Buddhism and temple Hinduism, it would have had very limited appeal. It would have just been seen as a foreign religion. But Vedanta and yoga and the way Buddhism was expressed, they could be understood and accepted by secular people who valued reason and logic and empirical, evidence. And so I think and that's why it caught on, and that's why so many people have been influenced them, even if they don't know it. Because many important people in the West, philosophers, intellectuals, artists, psychologists, have adopted these teachings to one degree or another and express them in their own work, and that filters out to the general public. So people might have a psychotherapist or read a psychology textbook that takes spirituality seriously and not even realize it's being influenced by Eastern traditions, but they have the. Just like, people can listen to certain Beatles songs or, Van Morrison or something and not realize that what's being expressed came from a spiritual teaching or practice. And here you are with the name Muhammad and a British accent, and so that reminds me of Cat Stevens, who who had a similar pathway, only through sort of mystical Islam. And so that there's these examples you can draw from cultural history. As I did this, that's what American Veda is about. It's about how all this happened in the West.
And yoga, tell us a little bit more about that. Nowadays, people consider yoga like a class at their local gym with Pilates and high intensity training. Tell us how yoga is understood in your tradition and how it can allow people to connect to the divine.
Yeah, it's a shame, but that's what happened. You're right. It's become sort of understood almost synonymously with physical practices of stretching and bending, and as a form of fitness or as a wellness practice. And that aspect of yoga is not to be diminished or degraded, because it's of great value to people. And for many people, that's enough. That's all it is. But in fact, that's all that aspect of yoga, the health, the physical practice, historically, and traditionally, that's just a small piece of what yoga is. Yoga philosophy is one of the 6 systems of Indian philosophy, and it's very similar to Vedanta, and people separate them, but in practice, the gurus, the swamis, the teachers, they draw from both. They integrate the teachings and practices of yoga and the ideas of Vedanta so much that when I wrote American Veda, I just hyphenated them and I talk about Vedanta yoga. And so, but yoga, the origin of the term means union or unity. And as a, a witty person once said, it doesn't just mean the union of the head to the knee when you stretch and do those practices. The true system of yoga includes physical practices, breathing practices, mental practices, and spiritual practices, principally meditation. And that whole package is a practical approach to higher consciousness and the union of the individual consciousness with what you could say is the cosmic consciousness or universal consciousness that some would call God and some would call infinity or the divine. And that ultimate union, like it is the experience that of what I described before in Vedantic terms of thou art that. So yoga is a method of self-realization and of finding fulfillment in the union of individual and universal.
In both Vedanta yoga, if we put it as a combined term, this realization that you are that on a superficial level you appear to exist, but on a deeper level you're just part of the universal consciousness. Where does that take you after that? I mean, is that a kind of experiential goal? Is it an attainment of truth which has its own value? Or do you see it really in terms of the practical effects it has in your life after achieving that realization?
I've always been a very practical guy, and there are people who look at these aspirational descriptions of higher consciousness and self-realization and take that on as a goal, as if there's some end point and that nothing matters until you get there. And I've seen too many people sacrifice or not fully appreciate where they are now and the journey along the way, and sometimes to the detriment of their relationships, their careers, and all the human stuff, uh, the learning and growth we have to do emotionally and psychologically. So to me, that aspirational aspect of one day you can be fully realized and life will be bliss and you'll be in full flowering of enlightenment. That's nice to have out there. But what really matters is, as someone once said, the great professor of religion, Houston Smith, once said, what matters is not altered states, but altered traits. So, how is it affecting your life, your practices, your understanding? You can have this experience of infinite consciousness and realize, oh yes, the seers were right. I am that. I can have that experience. And then what happens when it dissolves or goes away? How are you living your life? Has it affected your life? Are you a better person? Are you more compassionate? Can you love more deeply? Uh, do you experience more joy and happiness in your life? Or are you so obsessed with, having that experience again or ultimate realization that you're not fully engaged in the human aspect of what we are, but because you're trying to transcend it all the time? So I've always been like, and what's to back up a little bit, one of the reasons I think these teachings catch on and practices like meditation and yoga and whatever else people find that are on the experiential level transformative is they work, and it does make your life better. And it doesn't mean life is perfect. You'll still have the ups and downs, but you handle them differently. Their nature and quality are different. And so the human part of the equation is honored and affected by the spiritual, not that the human part has to be demeaned and transcended all the time. So that's my take on it anyway.
And would you say that if a practice leads to you being a better person, then it's almost academic whether it's true or not? The kind of philosophy behind it is true or not.
Yeah.
Would you say that the goal of all things is all of these practices, even religions, is to make humans better, and we shouldn't even be arguing about what's true or not because no one can really
That
establish it?
I know, and the truth claims of religion. One of the important learnings in my years as a seeker and everything was when I discovered what's called the Perennial Philosophy. That if you look at religions and spiritual traditions on the level of belief systems, views of history, do's and don'ts, this is true, that's not true. That that's what scholars call the exoteric aspects of religion, the externals. And that's, of course, as you suggest, where there's inevitable disagreements. And sometimes historically, those disagreements led to conflict and war. Um, but what the mystics have always understood from their own experience, and this is East and West, independent of culture, independent of uh, moments in history, that on the interior level, the experiential level, what the scholars call the esoteric level. That's where you find deep similarities in what people report. So if you look at the mystics of, say, Sufism, and the mystics like Meister Eckhart and Teresa of Avila of the Christian tradition, and the Kabbalists of the Jewish tradition, and the yogis in India, and the Buddhist monks, and the Taoists, you'll find they're saying in different languages, using different terminologies, basically the same things. Aldous Huxley and people like him discovered and verified these things through research. And Huxley published a book called The Perennial Philosophy in the 1940s. And by the time I discovered it in the late 60s or 70s, it had had a big impact. And it had a big impact on people like me who said, oh, now I get it. That's the real substance of what we call religion, not these silly superstitions and belief systems and things that don't hold up to science or history and that people want to fight over. No. And people always laugh that when mystics get together, they don't argue about this stuff. They just have fun. They having the same experience, and they learn from each other, and they say, oh, Sufis do this. Oh, let's try that. And there are certain role models of, that in history that, have had a great influence.
Now, there are some people who say that that's all well and good, and certainly maybe true even, but those individual people still took a particular route before they reached to that level of depth
Yeah.
or esoteric understanding. And some people maintain that you have to also tread a similar path before you reach that point. Your approach is obviously sounds a little different to that. Could you just explain that?
Well, no, I agree with that, but I also will say it's a very individual thing, and there are people who are cautionary about what's called the sort of cafeteria model of spirituality, and that's this is a new development because even people like, Ramakrishna in the 19th century, he could experiment with Christian and Muslim practices and conclude that, yeah, I, I have the same experience doing them that I do with my own traditional practices. But now anybody can, with the click of a mouse, have be exposed to teachings from every tradition, and YouTube videos of all kinds of practices in the name of spirituality and enlightenment and awakening and all that stuff, some of which are bogus and shouldn't be touched, and others of which are authentic. So we have this opportunity now, which is a great advantage, but it's also a disadvantage because it's like going to a supermarket. What do I buy here? I just need one cleansing product, and they're offering me 1,000 and promising all kinds of things. And so you can easily get confused. You can easily be misled, and you can keep experimenting so much promiscuously that you never go deep into anything. And that was always, the metaphor is, if you go to a big buffet and you just take what looks good, you're not necessarily getting good nourishment. And as one of the metaphors in India is, you can dig a lot of holes looking for water, but if you don't go deep enough into anything, you won't hit the water. And so we need to go deep, and we need to practice diligently and on a consistent basis. At the same time, any of us could go through an experimental phase and be searching. But when we find something that works, the good idea to go deeply into it. It doesn't mean that you do it for the rest of your life and not do other things. So ultimately, it's an individual thing, and there's times in one's life when experimenting makes sense. Other times when it makes sense to just focus on, or settle on something at least for a while and go deeply into it.
And if somebody is following this approach, doing this journey, what would you advise them to look out for as the outputs in their life which mark that they're making progress?
It's really simple in a certain way. Are you more content? Are you less anxious? Are you happier? Are your relationships, friendships, intimate relationships, family, are they going well? Do you have empathy? Do you have compassion? Do you have love? When things go wrong, do you recover quickly? When you're under stress, do you have a little more inner calm than you once did? When you lose your temper, when you go through a loss or difficulty, uh, is can you maintain, do you maintain some element of inner peace? And if you lose it, can you come back to it? Those are the things I look for. And that there's a good deal of research that these practices can do those things. This is important stuff. And there's no better laboratory than the reality of our human life. So you can take these teachings as hypotheses, and hypotheses have to be put to the test. And the test is when if you do these things, do they have a good impact on your life?
Why do you think all of the different mystical traditions arrive at a place of compassion or love in particular?
They arrive at the deepest aspect of ourself, which is one of profound inner peace and stability. Because what we are, in essence, in that thou art that sense, is the stuff of the cosmos. And that is beyond our usual understanding of pleasure and happiness. It's a state of utter contentment that people call bliss or joy. Um, the expression of that is love. You could say the essence of that, the substance of that. In the West, we say God is love. And some people, I never understood that God loves you as things, when people say that. But God is love, or the divine, one of the characteristics of the nature of the universe is what we call love. That's how we feel it. And so the capacity to feel love expresses itself in compassion and kindness and generosity. So they would be natural outgrowths of the experiencing and stabilizing the experience of what we truly are, of our internal essence. It's a natural byproduct, which is not to say that somebody who claims to have arrived at some higher consciousness, or is on the way, or is experiencing it more and more, is somehow some perfect moral and ethical being. That expectation has led to a lot of problems. I'm on the board of something called the Association for Spiritual Integrity, which was created because of so much disappointment in the behavior of presumably awakened spiritual teachers and gurus and so forth, who were capable of exploitation and abuse. And so we shouldn't have the expectation that, taking up these practices will lead to some kind of human perfection overnight. But there should be gradual progress along the way. But we have to be diligent, and we have to, put ourselves to the test and be discerning and discriminating about evaluating other people making claims about themselves.
On that note, how important do you think following is for a seeker? I mean, traditionally, you had to have a guru or a sheikh or some sort of master who would kind of lead you by the hand through. But it sounds like what you've been describing is more of a navigate yourself approach.
Well, yes, but navigating yourself also, there's a little paradox in life on the spiritual path. There are many paradoxes. And one of them is we're on our own and we have to be our own best guides, but we all need teachers. We all need people who know stuff we don't. That's how we learn. That's how we grow. Um, and we should be grateful that those people exist. But we have to be careful in choosing our teachers and in formulating how we relate to the teachers. There are models of teacher-student relationship where you give up your will and you surrender to the guru, whoever. Um, that's risky because it could be a bad match, or the guru could be a charlatan, or just an imperfect human being. So we have to be careful about treating teachers with respect, but not putting them on pedestals and assuming they're perfect and assuming that everything they say is divinely inspired, and to maintain our own sense of discernment and ask tough questions. And if your questions are asked and you're made to feel like there's something wrong with you for asking, that's a red flag.
When you read about some of the mystics in history, they seem to have gone beyond the stage of needing teachers. They're in
Yeah.
communion or union with the divine directly. Why can't the novice also just take the same approach?
But those mystics usually had teachers before they arrived at that
Yeah.
state where they don't need teachers.
So that's the question. What if you've got this universal consciousness or this divine out there, why can't it just guide you directly? Why does it need teachers
And,
to do it
and in some cases
through?
it does. But, the Buddhists say that all the teachings and the books and the texts are like fingers pointing to the moon. And that's usually understood as a caution. Don't mistake the finger pointing to the moon for the moon itself. It's pointing to it. Now look at the moon, and you'll have a direct experience of the moon. All the teachings point you to your inner self as your own best guru. But we need the teachings to tell us that and teach us that, and in some cases, methods and guidance that ultimately do that. And so that's one of the paradoxes. And for some people, they never have a close relationship with a guru or a most important mentor. And that might work perfectly well for them, but they have many guides along the way. They learn from this source, they learn from that source. In India, they say one needs a sadguru, the guru who takes you to enlightenment, the principal guru. But you should and can have many upagurus, people you learn from, people who help you along the path, people who are expert in certain things or have certain insights that you need at this moment. And so we should be open, but at the same time discerning. And sometimes, somebody will say, I don't want a guru, I don't want a main teacher. And then somebody will come along from whom they learn, and they may just spend a lot of time with that person and focus on that person's teachings, go to their retreats and so forth, and then move on. Or they become a lifelong commitment. It's all individual.
Would you say mystics are lonely people?
That's a good question. I I know a lot of mystics in the world, who have families and friends and so forth. There are, of course, renunciates. There are mystics who prefer seclusion. They live in caves, they live in ashrams. But are they lonely, or they are just supremely content renunciates? I don't know. I can't tell.
In a world or a society where spiritual awakening is maybe not the norm, or the things that motivate or concern people are maybe not spiritual, do spiritually inclined people feel a bit left out?
You can feel like a misfit. You can feel like a weirdo, and there will be people who make you feel that way. But I can tell you, as someone who qualifies as an elder now, that it used to be a whole lot worse. I mean, back in the day, if I said, well, I'm going, can we do it a half hour later because I want to get my meditation? And they would, I'd be mocked. I'd be laughed at. I mean, I remember times when I was meditating every day, and I'd be busy, and I'd be out in the world and say, oh, I'll just sit on this park bench and meditate here. And people would see someone sitting there with their eyes closed and think that, what's wrong with that person? Are they well? Are they, but now you wouldn't, but, that wouldn't attract attention. If somebody, spread a blanket on a park lawn and did yoga stretches, or sat in lotus and, stared at a tree, no one would blink. So, things change. But at the same time, depending on who your circle of friends are and your family, yeah, you can be made to feel like you're some kind of strange weirdo. But it's a whole lot different now. I mean, now, healthcare providers will tell you it's a good idea to meditate, and corporations have meditation and yoga rooms. So it's changed a lot.
Tell us about karma. What have we understood? What have we got right about karma, and what have we misunderstood about karma?
Thank you for the segue to my latest book, Karmic Relief. I wrote that book because I kept hearing the word karma being used in public situations, newscasts, television shows, song lyrics. Even Taylor Swift has a song titled Karma. And I thought, well, this is a symptom of what I've described in my books and my talks of teachings from the East finding their way into Western culture. And people mean by it a kind of shorthand for cosmic justice, that, there's cause and effect at work in the universe, and what we do comes back to us. You reap what you sow, sort of thing. And that's not inaccurate. But then in the details, you find people misunderstanding it and misusing it in various ways. And that's why I wrote Karmic Relief. And one of the ways they misuse it is is they think they invoke karma when something bad happens. Oh, somebody broke into your house, you had a car accident, karma. Karma's a bitch. Karma's going to get you. That's what the songs are about. You done me wrong. Karma's going to get you now. But karma is an, indifferent law of cause and effect that is best. It's not it's not best understood as a system of reward and punishment. For one thing, all the good stuff that happens to us is also karma. People listening to this have the good karma of maybe learning something from this conversation. If you have hot running water, you have very good karma compared to most people in the history of the universe. So good stuff is karma. Our good families are karma. All that, everything is karma. But the other part of that is we tend to think of it as a system of reward and punishment, almost as if there's a supreme magistrate doling out karma credit and karma debits and punishing this and rewarding that. But the sages of the Hindu and Buddhist traditions, especially where these things have been fleshed out, they describe it more like laws of physics. More like, in thermodynamics, there's this principle that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So if you apply that to human life and human behavior, it's very similar. Everything we say, everything we do, everything we think has, an impact out there throughout the universe in one degree or another. And it comes back in some form or another that is impossible to predict and impossible to foresee in its details. But these are like laws of nature. So thinking of them in terms of consequences and effects that we experience as either wanted or unwanted, desirable or undesirable, pleasurable or painful, but they're just like, if you put your hand on the stove and it burns, we experience as negative, but it's just the laws of physics playing out. And it's a similar way with karma, causes and effects. The other thing that's important to realize is it's not fatalism. It's not determinism. It's really a system that places responsibility and freedom on each of us. We have if something bad happens, oh yes, it's karma. But how do we react to it? And what do we do next? That's creating the karma going forward. And we have freedom in that and responsibility in that.
So, two things I got from that. One, that actions we do in our own lives have some sort of cosmic relationship. It's not just within our immediate sphere of perception. And secondly, that they bounce back to us in particular,
Yeah.
um, which makes you have a much more vested interest, I guess, in
Yeah.
doing the right thing. Do you see karma as a vehicle for making the world better?
I had to address that in the book. And I know people who will say, oh, if only everybody understood karma, they would behave so much better and the world would be a better place. But then in reality, you see some of the great philosophers and spiritual teachers who taught us about karma not always behaving as if they understood that this stuff is, because they may think they're beyond the laws of karma and they're still human and they're still subject to these things. So in my experience, people who accept or accept even that karma might be true, that the laws of karma might be effective in the world. And I could tell you this from my personal experience. I can't prove that everything we do eventually comes back to us. That's unprovable. But I lean in the direction that that's probably true. And when I put it to the test, if I think about what I'm about to decide or the choice I'm about to make, if I think, yeah, but what about karma? I'll make a better choice. I'll make a kinder, more generous choice for out of self-interest, if nothing else. And so it could have that effect on people's behavior, but nothing is guaranteed. We're human. We can always rationalize in our own self-interest to say, yeah, well, that's karma, but this is also karma. And maybe in this, so I'm going to go for this. And so it's not a guarantee, but it's one of the things that would help.
You advise people, you're still an active spiritual guide and advisor. What do you think are the main spiritual needs of the people who come to you in these days?
That's a good question. I don't do as much of it as I used to, But in my experience with people, a lot of it is just, I'm having this problem in my marriage or my kids or whatever. It's just the usual stuff of life. And if they have a spiritual orientation, they want to understand it and address it in a spiritual context, as opposed to only perhaps a medical context or a psychotherapeutic process, all of which might be applicable. So framing it in a spiritual way, framing it as the laws of karma at effect is often very helpful. And that's what, sort of, but it's usually just the everyday stuff. Sometimes it's more. It's like, I've been practicing this stuff for years, and I used to feel close. I had this sense of inner peace and connection to the divine, and I've lost it. After my marriage broke up, blah, 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 or after I got sick, or it just faded away and I want it back, or I'm feeling spiritually restless. I'm much more advanced than I used to be, but I'm feeling like I need something new and different. And what do you advise? And things like that. And we all come to those points, those turning points in our spiritual path, where it's like, some people call it a dark night of the soul. But sometimes it's just an inkling of like, yeah, I've made a lot of progress. It's time for another step. It's time for a, booster shot or whatever.
And final question, Phil. Say if somebody has been listening to this and thought, I quite like some of these ideas. What's one practical thing that they could do tomorrow to start on this journey or go further on this journey? Just a simple practical thing they could do tomorrow.
The self-serving thing to say would be to subscribe to my Substack page and my podcast. But if they want to hear more from me, that's what they can do. But there's teachers everywhere, and good ones. There's books everywhere. There's podcasts and YouTube videos. Just take the next obvious step. What do you want to know best next? What do you need to learn? What draws your attention? Talk to your friends. Yeah, what have you read lately? What have you seen online? There's just I don't want to just say read this or see that teacher, because it doesn't work for everybody.
So take a step according to what you feel
Yeah,
drawn
follow your curiosity, follow your heart, talk to fellow seekers, get advice, but don't give up your discernment.
Philip Goldberg, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thanks for the good conversation.